Hello. In this new episode of the Heirs for Architecture podcast, writer and organiser Alva Gotby discusses her latest book, Feeling at Home, Transforming the Politics of Housing, published by Verso in January this year. Feeling at Home is rooted in Marxist feminism and approaches housing as more than shelter, but rather as a key site for reproducing labour power under capitalism, perpetuating all the inequalities. Alva extends this critique, proposing what is called family abolitionism, arguing for the collectivisation of domestic life, the better to dismantle the nuclear family as a capitalist institution. But Alva isn't also pleading for a nostalgic return to the paternalistic state, but proposes instead collective alternatives that prioritise marginalised people and ecological sustainability.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Heirs for Architecture podcast. I'm talking today to author, scholar, Alva Gotby. Alva, thank you so very much for joining me. We're going to be talking about your book, Feeling at Home, Transforming the Politics of Housing, which you published with Verso in January this year. And it's a great book. It's a very interesting book. It's a very challenging book to someone like me, which is why I wanted to have you on the podcast, because I think challenge is wonderful medicine. But before we start talking about some of themes of that book, as all my guests do, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks so much for having me. So I am a former academic. I did my PhD at the University of West London a few years ago, and out of that came my first book, which is called They Call It Love, which is a sort of theory of emotions and gender under capitalism. And then after that, I kind of dropped out of academia. I went to work for a tenants union. So I developed a sort of interest in housing and housing politics and architecture. And based on that experience, I wrote my second book, Feeling at Home.
So you're not trained in architecture?
Yeah, that's right.
What did you train in? Literature?
I trained in philosophy originally, and then my PhD was in media studies, although you couldn't tell from reading the book, I think.
Okay, it's philosophy of what, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of sort of political philosophy, feminist philosophy, and that has sort of been the basis of my thinking, I think, and including in architecture, sort of. I, as you said, I'm not a trained architect or in architectural theory, but I'm sort of have an interest in architecture, but coming from a perspective of feminist theory, I would say.
So, what is that journey? It would be really useful to know who are the significant sort of wayfinders in that journey. I can see it in people like Henri Lefebvre, and I can see it in other philosophers of that kind. Is that the kind of starting gun, the kind of mid-20th century shift towards a feminist interpretation or engagement with the urban and the spatial and the architectural?
I think I come from it from a slightly different perspective of sort of feminist theories of domestic space, I would say, which is starting much more from, I guess, less from a perspective of thinking about buildings per se, but thinking about how that space is sort of lived and experienced, and thinking about domestic labor as the sort of experience that at that point many women would have of being housewives and like sort of experiencing their homes in a way as a site of confinement and as a site of labor. So it's a very like critical perspective on housing that you can draw out from that. It's quite implicit in their writing a lot of the time, how they talk about space. And I wouldn't say that there's like a big theory of architecture in there, but yeah, it's sort of a perspective on housing and the domestic space that I think you don't necessarily get from a lot of the sort of big theories of architecture. It's much more grounded in people's experience of living in those spaces and working to sort of feed their families, and how that has shaped women's experience of their home.
So this is scholars like Dolores Haydon, I'm assuming.
Yes, definitely. Haydn is a very important source of inspiration for this, and I think she has done such a great job to challenge our assumptions about what home is by sort of rediscovering this tradition of sort of half forgotten utopian feminist thinkers of home who had a very different idea of what home could look like and often have a sort of very challenging um, view of how home could be transformed, how it could be shared in different ways. It's not assuming a sort of traditional household, and it's very focused on the labors that happen in the home, so cooking and cleaning, childcare, that kind of thing.
Yes, all that minutiae. It's very interesting, and I would love to sort of understand a little more about this because I think it's something that we've all kind of taken on board without understanding its chronology and perhaps the precision of the critique. Rather, there's a kind of generalized critique, which, in my view, around other subjects, other significant philosophies, has a tendency to kind of therefore enable it to be co opted by losing its precision, by becoming, like, for example, the concept of co production, something that I care about. I did my PhD around co production. I'm anally retentive about being specific and definitive about what it is. And then you just see it like chucked around like a rag doll and you suddenly realize that it's been co-opted. And actually it's not doing what anybody ever intended it to do. And I wonder if that's the case with feminist theories of space as well. Like we're all feminists now, but that's possibly because capitalism's got hold of it and operationalized it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that risk of co-optation is sort of unavoidable, I think. Capital and the state will always, try to co-opt various streams. I think it's hard to find something that's fully like
Hmm.
immune to that co-optation. But then I think it's the question of how do we challenge that and how do we sort of bring it back to its origin, what those terms were actually intended to do in the first place. So yeah, that's I think always a big problem for any um, sort of more attempt to have a more sort of radical theory of home or architecture because it's so you sort of always encounter the state in some way. It's not something that you can do as just a little um, group of people, and in order to actually build things and put things into practice, you need a lot of money. So it's I think a sort of area of politics, if you will, that is it's very open to cooptation because of how um, shaped that is by both state involvement and money, and especially I guess in cities now where land is so
Mm.
expensive and you can't really do anything without having enormous amounts of money. Yeah, that's always going to be a risk.
Yeah, for sure. I was talking to one of my colleagues, Chloe Young, who's writing her PhD and is very excited to read your book, actually, because she's looking at domestic space as well.
Mm,
We were talking about this problematic that is at the heart of the architecture or the production of buildings, which is someone has to be in charge, like because somebody's got to take responsibility for its integrity, its structural integrity. Like
mm,
we've got to be able to blame someone when the tower block goes on fire and 77 people dies.
yeah.
And that's kind of critical to the profession. It's like at a certain point, it's structured in a way that resists a full disassembling. But anyway, I want to come to your book, Feeling at Home, and it's beautifully written and beautifully published, of course. That's how Verso operate. There is at the heart of it an antagonism towards the kind of neoliberal capitalist system
Mm.
and the form of housing, the form of, I guess you would say, domesticity that this has procured. And I think that fits with a lot of kind of scholarship at the time. What is the central, in your view, what is the central kind of critique that underpins the work?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to write something that was both based on my own experience as a tenant organizer. So in that work, meeting lots of people and talking about how they experience the housing. And I think what I saw in a lot of the books that have been published in the last few years about housing politics, it's a critique of the cost of housing, and it's often a critique of the ownership of housing. So a lot of the people who are sort of writing in the same tradition as me would be thinking about how do we expand the amount of council housing or social housing that's being produced, and how do we sort of bring down house prices so housing becomes more affordable, which I think is absolutely a really important project. And I think my book is sort of starting from that point that of course we want to do that. Of course we want housing to be more affordable. Of course we want to have more public housing. But I think what I wanted to add was this perspective of people's experience of their own housing, and that includes people who are currently living in council housing, for example, and don't have a like this rosy experience of this is all fine. So I wanted to root my critique more in people's sort of daily lives, the experience of domestic labor that still takes place largely within people's homes, and also just the sort of experience of that space, which is often not this sort of romantic idea that I think we still have of home in society. But the other thing that I wanted to do is to sort of say that we can't just go back to this, I think, sometimes sort of romantic or nostalgic idea of post-war council housing as the sort of division for what the future should be. Sometimes I hear people say, "Oh well, if we could just do the same thing as the state was sort of able to do in the post-war years, which is to build massive amounts of council housing, then we would have a housing system that's fair, that's more affordable, and that's sort of meeting people's needs." And so I kind of wanted to challenge that a little bit, and say, look, even that would be the obviously there are reasons why you couldn't really do that again. I think the conditions for that were quite specific, but also like even if you were able to do that, that would still mean that a lot of the sort of negative experiences people have of their housing wouldn't be resolved by that. And so we can't just return to this sort of mid 20th century idea of home, because they were so based on a sort of particular ideas of nuclear families, basically. And I'm interested both in what that does to the people who sort of work to make those households function, but also the people who aren't part of that at all, who are sort of excluded from this idea of the white nuclear family as the sort of ideal inhabitants of that sort of post-war ideal.
Yeah, okay, I kind of get that. I think we'll come onto that idea a little bit more in a bit. But there seems also in the book to be this idea that home has changed in its fundamental character. What we mean when we talk about home, this kitchen, dining room, sitting room, 2 bedrooms and a box room upstairs, little front garden, big back garden. This image of domesticity is unfitting for our age, and that something fundamental has shifted in our perception, or needs to shift, perhaps, in our perception. What has changed? Why is that model no longer appropriate to the context? What transformations have occurred such that that is so?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I think that model was never really appropriate for a lot of people. But I would also say that the sort of core ideal that was based on, which is a sort of, as I said, a sort of nuclear family structure where the man is working outside the home and the woman is working in the home, that just doesn't really exist anymore. And I think a lot of the pressures that sort of come from the society that we live in now, where people are often in sort of precarious, underpaid work, and also, might be struggling to sort of raise a family, to take care of their children. Sort of just returning to that vision of the privatized, like one family house with a nice little garden. That isn't really possible because people's like the structure of people's lives has changed so much that the model of the household that was based on. I mean, it still exists in some versions, but it's been sort of weakened or undermined in various ways. And what people actually need to meet their needs is sort of homes or household structures that could go beyond that. I think a fairly like narrow vision of what the good life is and what a good home is.
Do you think that that image is fundamentally sort of stultifying and restrictive and procures bad social and health well-being outcomes? Not just at the level of infected homes or poor concrete or mold or asbestos or expanded foam insulation or whatever it is. It's like at the level of the spatiality of it, at the level of even the ideation of it or the imaginary of it, it has this negative psychophysiological effect.
I mean, that's a fairly like strong claim, but it's interesting for me. I'm from Sweden originally, so I grew up with a housing system that's very different, and that sort of emphasizes flats much more than houses if you live in a sort of urban environment, and also. I mean, it's not so present now, but there's a sort of stronger history of shared space in that as well. And so you would like all blocks of flats will have like shared laundry spaces and things like that. And I guess what I'm sort of critical in this vision of like the self-contained one family home is that it's I think really restricting and restraining what people can do in that space, and it's also like really lacking in that shared spaces where people can sort of come together and start to like look after children together, and maybe even do some cooking or like do laundry in shared spaces. And so this emphasis on the sort of individualized, privatized one family home, it's very based on this idea of like each family unit should have its own thing and do its own work and look after its own children. And I think that's the idea that I'm trying to sort of critique in the book.
It seems to me that what you're proposing has precedent in other cultures, particularly in lower income and more traditional communities. And certainly historically, that model of the integrated domestic space. And so what you seem to me to be suggesting actually has quite traditional ideas behind it. And that what you seem to be suggesting is the atomization common to modernity and modernization, or the form of modernization that we've chosen to pursue, is the problem. And that there's this looking back to find something that's better than this atomized, alienated modernity. I mean, is that the fundamental critique? Like modernity is tearing us apart and it's unhappy and improper?
I don't think the problem is with modernity per se. I mean, and I'm very not a sort of thinker that would, draw on sort of pre-capitalist examples and say we should return to this, we should return to a sort of urban, sort of rural life that's more simple and where different generations are living together. I think there are obviously lots of issues with that model, and especially if we're looking at it from a sort of perspective of gender, it's quite obvious that that's also a very patriarchal system. And so I guess what I'm trying to do is maybe not so much say we should return to those previous models of households, but more say that the sort of idea that we have become so used to, which is that each family unit sort of owning their own family home, and having this sort of domestic space that is privatized and that they controlled, that is the exception. And that hasn't been, for most of human history, that hasn't been the norm. And so it's kind of trying to like denaturalize that in a way and say we take this for granted now, and we still holding on to that as the ideal, even as it becomes sort of more and more impossible for most people. But that there's a much longer history, and there's other ideas for how we could arrange our homes and how we could arrange domesticity, that aren't based on that model that sort of emerged in the 19th century and then became really dominant in the 20th century, of home as this very contained space for a nuclear household.
Where did it come from? I mean, where does this idea, so 19th century, is it to do with industrialism? And does it emerge first in working class houses, or does it emerge in the housing of the middle classes, the bourgeoisie? Or is it a modeling of a kind of aristocratic typology? I would like, and which kind of countries start generating this stuff first?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of the way that I think about this history is thinking about it as a form that emerges in the bourgeoisie first, in their sort of way of distinguishing themselves from the aristocracy in a way, as the sort of the rising dominant class in the 19th century. And it's based on a sort of idea of the bourgeois family as like a family that's different from both the working class and the aristocracy. It's much more focused on the nuclear family. So the aristocracy, you have this very big houses, millions of servants, big households, big extended households, and then the bourgeoisie say no. Actually, the modern way of family life is to have this very small, this very tight sort of family unit. And obviously, there were still servants living in those households, but that became much more sort of invisible, and the focus was very much on the woman in that household being the sort of the angel of the home, as people were saying, and this very sort of romanticized ideal of the domestic space as completely distinct from what's happening outside of it. So these very hard boundaries between private and public as a way of distinguishing the domestic space from the urban, the sort of industrial city, and the family unit sort of withdrawing into the household as a sort of in a way, a sort of sacred space, that was a woman's space where women were tasked with creating this space of domesticity where men could like return from their work out there in the world. And I think so. It started in a sort of bourgeois cultural environment, but as that became the dominant environment in capitalist cities, it was then part imposed and partly willingly adopted by working class people. The sort of more skilled working class aspired to something similar. Many people wanted to take the woman in that household sort of out of the workforce, And it did mean a massive increase in living standards for a lot of people. But what it also produced was a situation where women were incredibly financially dependent on their husbands, and were also doing lots of work in their homes that weren't really seen as work or weren't counted as work. And then you also have a sort of in the more like earlier 20th century or late 19th century, that sort of transition where lots of so-called slums are being demolished to make space for modern housing. And that is also a massive change in working class sort of social life, but also arrangements of households. And that's part of how a more sort of nuclear family structure is kind of imposed on working class families. And a lot of the previous ways of life of people having a sort of household structure that was much less reliant on clear distinctions between the public and the private, the street and the home, the family and like neighbors, that was sort of undone in this process as well.
Right. Because I was going to ask next, tell me a bit more about this idea of gendered space and how space reproduces gender, but I think you've covered that. Is there a sense also in this domesticity? And I was minded of this when you were first talking, when we first started talking, about the idea of unmaking home. And there's a paper that I started writing a paper myself on around this notion of making and unmaking home. But this idea of the notion of the privatized spaces as both problematic, but also, not to put too fine a point on it, sort of nonsense. Like that doesn't really exist.
Mm.
And that the boundaries between the private and the public are always porous to some degree, like physically porous. You can see
Yeah.
through windows. But also that the social roles that exist within homes that are ostensibly private have broader social impact. So I'm kind of interested in the way that this reproduction of gendered roles
Mm.
has an impact beyond the individuated home, but is also then also reproduced at the level of the neighborhood or the street or the district within the city. Is there any sense that that is also, and is that something that you kind of turn your attention to in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely very interested in what the sort of interplay between the home and then other things that might or might not exist outside the home. And that might be things like nurseries, schools, and things that you could have in your neighborhood or not. But also, um, you could think of yeah, as I mentioned, like shared laundry facilities and other places that people can use in order to like carry out the work of the household. Um, and I think it's interesting to me because yeah, as you said, the bourgeois home has never really existed as it's sort of been imagined as this very contained space that is sort of completely cut off from the outside world. There's always been it's always been reliant, I think, on resources and forms of labor that's sort of coming from the outside world. But I think what you can also see now, when a lot of sort of those spaces of reproductive labor and sort of childcare and a lot of other things have sort of been removed, then how does that put more pressure on the household? What does the sort of shrinking public sphere and austerity measures mean? And I think what that means is that it also puts more pressure on the individual household, which doesn't really have the resources to sort of meet all of its needs. But yeah, as sort of more communal spaces disappear, community centers, spaces where kids and teenagers can spend time and are sort of supervised by other people than their parents, maybe. Those spaces, I think, are disappearing, and they're sort of shrinking, and that in turn puts more pressure on the sort of individual family home to like fill all of those functions that they actually can't really do.
Your book is obviously very interested in the issue around renters and the precarity of renting. And until 6 years ago, I was a renter. So it's something I know intimately and I didn't enjoy particularly, although owning a home is bloody expensive. No one tells you. It's like a money sump. It's a nightmare. It absolutely absorbs all of your spare money.
Mm,
It's a total nonsense. It is the most stupid, like the housing purchase system in the UK is the most stupid system ever.
yeah.
It's so expensive. But anyway, renting is even more expensive. Can you talk a little bit about how renting specifically affects these kinds of negative outcomes? And is there a specific characteristic to the experience of home for renters through your research and through your writing that you've found that is particular and needs particular attention within
Mm.
the system that we've got?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question and one that doesn't come up enough, I think, in conversations, even about renting, is people's sort of daily experience and how that impacts their household lives, their family lives. And when I talk to people, when I talk to renters, often working class women who have come because they have some kind of problem with their housing. So they come to the organization that I work for. And it's striking how much work that people put into making a home in these conditions that, are very, that sort of makes it very difficult. And so people are facing frequent evictions, so they have to move and then start all over again in a new place. They are living with housing conditions like mold, or other like health hazards in their homes that makes it very difficult to create that feeling of home, right?
Mm.
But people, do put a lot of work into making the homes as safe as possible for their families, as safe as possible for their children. And obviously this is creating an enormous like mental burden and a lot of stress and anxiety. I would say especially for the mothers who are sort of still seen as the people ultimately responsible for the well-being of their children. And so yeah, I think that's really important. And also the amount of like stigma that people still feel, because home is such an intimate space. It's almost like the home living with bad housing conditions, even though we know that that's something that's sort of created by a political system, and it's not an individual responsibility, right? But a lot of people still feel like their bad housing conditions are sort of their fault. It's reflecting on their character. And so people feel a lot of shame and stigma around their housing conditions, which I think is also preventing people sometimes from challenging their landlords, from speaking out about their housing conditions. So there's always that sort of subjective experience that makes home or housing politics sometimes quite hard to change, because people, they want things to be better, but they also don't feel able to really challenge their own housing conditions in a political way because it feels so individualized and sort of stigmatized.
Yeah. And of course, I know people say this, and I think I mention this probably too often on this podcast, but this notion that, as you mentioned at the beginning, more housing is going to resolve the problem is patently false. Like
Mm,
65% of people in the UK or households in the UK are owner occupiers. They're not going to tolerate someone crashing house prices. Nobody is. Like no political party is ever going to do that. So they can build as many houses as they like. I guarantee it won't affect the upward trajectory of house prices. It can't.
mm.
It literally can't. It's impossible for that to be the case. And I think everybody, even when they vote for parties that say they're going to resolve the housing crisis, they're doing it in the sure knowledge that they're not.
Mm.
Like left wing or right wing, they're doing it in the sure knowledge that actually nothing will be done because it would lead to genuine revolution. Like genuinely, it would lead to revolution. And not a pretty one, not one in which the good guys came out on top. So I think that for me is kind of like has to be right at the heart of it. The renter problem is only a problem for a third of the people. So in a democratic system, is that a problem? Only insofar as it makes us perhaps feel a little bit awkward.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting when political parties, the current government, are increasingly saying, oh, we need to do something about renting. It's becoming such a big problem for so many people. And, even homeowners might say, oh, I don't want my children to sort of go through this horrible experience of private renting and getting evicted all the time. And so might, have some sympathy for that. But as you say, there's also this sort of broad cross party consensus that we have to maintain house prices at all costs because that's sort of the source of both the national economy and sort of individual like households feeling of security and economic stability. And so, yeah, I guess development since the 1980s especially have sort of really emphasized that house prices are, how people can have some sense of economic security, and I think that has really, led us to the situation where we are now, where all the political parties are saying, "Oh, we're going to do something for renters," and are sort of trying to buy that renter vote in a way, and this is a significant one. As you said, it's 1/3, but that's sort of now a significant enough part of the electorate that political parties are starting to care about it and take it seriously, and also, has been an upswing in organizing around housing as well. But on the other hand, they are saying, well, we won't do anything that's so significant that it would actually impact house prices. And then I think you get some of these quite weird policy solutions, which are, that aren't really, they're sort of just fiddling with the system in a way, and saying, oh, we'll help first-time buyers get on the housing ladder, or we'll build lots of houses. And that sounds really good when they come up with these big numbers, 1.5 million homes. That sounds like a significant thing, but they if that was actually going to change the system more fundamentally, I think they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't say it. So there's always this balance, I think, between that they're trying to strike between the home-owning majority, but also the sort of renter class of people, if we put it that way, who are like becoming more vocal just because of how unjust and how expensive the system of renting has become.
I want to move on to your critique of defensible space, because this comes back to the idea of domesticity in the urban realm, or in the public realm, that kind of threshold between the two and its incoherence or its fuzziness. And you critique people like Alice Coleman and Jane Jacobs, and as I put in my notes to you, that's very naughty for architects because she's a bit of a hero or heroine. Oscar Newman. And you talk about how their approach kind of reinforces exclusive or exclusionary domesticity. How does this work? What do you mean by this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that people are so very into Jane Jacobs's writing, and I guess there's definitely difference between her and Alice Coleman. Alice Coleman wrote this book called Utopia on Trial, which is it's a very strange book, and it has these very strange ideas of, removing the upper stories of tower blocks and things like that, it just seem a bit insane. And but I guess I wanted to sort of trace that legacy back to Jane Jacobs in a way, and say, even though Jacobs presented a more sort of palatable or liberal version of this, it's still based on this idea that if you have a very clear distinction between the private and the public, if you make that as clear as possible for people, then that will reduce crime. It will sort of facilitate a sort of collective surveillance of public spaces, and that will make us all safer. And so I guess I wanted to challenge that idea a little bit, and say, both, I think that has never really worked, and the people it's worked best for are the people who are enormously wealthy and can live in gated communities and, have these very strict demarcations. But also, I think that's just not a very desirable ideal for how we live our lives. I think this focus on the demarcation between the private and the public, between like being able to separate who belongs and who doesn't, and excluding strangers from their like domestic living environment. It's a sort of reactionary ideal in some ways, and the way it's played out often is, and it's often quite racist. It's sort of policing public spaces in a way, who's sort of able to move around in public space that's near private households, and in what kinds of behaviors are acceptable there. I also want to sort of champion a slightly different ideal that I think has often developed in working class communities, but it's not something that just spontaneously emerges. I think it's something that has to be built, but it's something that's much more focused on what can we actually do with shared spaces, what kind of lives could we lead if we were using spaces collectively, what could happen if we focus on sort of lessening that distinction between the private and the public. And there's this book called Abolish Rent, by Tracy Rosenthal and Leonardo Villapis, which is talking about their experience in Los Angeles. And they have this wonderful example of some people starting to treat their apartment building as a sort of shared space, people repurposing an alleyway behind the building as a communal space, and sort of using that as a community resource, a place for coming together, for organizing, but also doing things like watching films together. And for me, that's just such an interesting example of people, repurposing these spaces that I think especially Coleman and Oscar Newman like really hated this sort of semi-private space or semi-public space that doesn't belong to the private household but also isn't fully public. And so, yeah, I'm interested in those spaces and thinking about what is it that we could do with them that is actually using them. And so I think the sort of distinction, I guess, comes down to, can people share spaces? Can people use those spaces in a way that's actually, adding something to the private household rather than just seeing them as a sort of breeding ground of crime and property damage?
I wanted to finish on this one particular thing, and I want to use your provocation around family abolition.
Mm.
You talk about, in chapter 8, talk about collective housing and the abolition of the family. This is a challenging thing and not an easy thing I'm a married man with children. I like my family. What do you mean by the abolition of the family? And I guess, what does it stimulate in your own writing? And what does it stimulate in the realm of the domestic that is productive and generative and progressive into the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of family abolition, I mean, it goes back a long way. And when you look at the sort of architectural experiments that someone like Dolores Hayden is interested in, you can see that idea has a long tradition as well. But I guess it's had a recent resurgence because people were becoming interested again in thinking about the limitations of the private household as this unit that is supposed to meet all of our needs, where we can find all of the safety and security that we need, and that can sort of provide all of the cooking and cleaning and other forms of domestic labor that we need. And I think the critique is coming from both the place of saying, well, the private family household has actually never been able to do all of that, and that it's not this place of refuge or safety that it's sort of imagined as. And that isn't to say that all families are bad. Lots of people love their families and, have that's the sort of very meaningful connections that they have is often in the family units. And I think no one is sort of who's writing in that tradition of family abolition is denying the sort of enormous emotional connection that people have with their families. But it's more saying that lots of people don't have access to that. For many people, their family is a space of violence or domination, but also that we could sort of remake our daily lives, our intimate lives, our connections with the people around us that is less sort of contained or built on these very strict divisions between the family units and the world outside them. And maybe that would be a good thing. Care, different forms of care has been very sort of privatized under capitalism. Your access to care and the things that you need to live a sort of good and decent lives are very contingent on being part of a family unit or having support from your family a lot of the time. So it's trying to think about, could we go beyond the family to create systems and ways of being together and resources that would actually benefit everyone. And so that's where that impulse is coming from. It's trying to take this unit, this social unit that has become very naturalized and is just seen as the sort of natural basis of all social life, and say, actually, could we arrange our lives differently? Could we live in different household structures? Could our domestic spaces have a different form that's not sort of assuming automatically that each household will sort of cook for itself and have its own little kitchen? And yeah, I think for me, there's just something very productive in that sort of challenge to the things that we take for granted, and that is sort of so emotionally charged for lots of people because people are very emotionally invested in their own families, and say, actually, this is quite an interesting starting point for thinking about a way of life that is different and could actually be better at meeting people's daily needs.
That's a wonderful point to finish on. Thank you very much, Alva. It was great to hear you talk.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, Nikita, you will never know anything about my home. So sang Elton John, perspicacious pop prince of England, in 1985, prophesying inadvertently, I assume, the central thesis of Alva's book. Thanks to Alva for speaking to me and to Verso for the book. Please see the podcast description for links to the book and to Alva on the socials. And thanks for listening.